There were three kinds of men on this train that night. One who believed his genius could decode the entire universe. One who had already returned from the very bottom of madness. And one, me, who thought he was just moving from one city to another, not from one reality to another. We were not just traveling from Moscow to Vladivostok. That night, inside this carriage, something else was moving. A mind was about to crack. A truth was about to surface. And a long-buried silence was about to speak. I know this now. If there is such a thing as a curse, it does not live in a Babylonian tablet. It lives inside the human mind. This is the Cipher of Silence. If a frozen iteration of hell exists, we were passing through it that night. The Trans-Siberian Express moved along that infinite iron line stretching from Moscow to Vladivostok, emitting metallic groans that resembled the moans of a wounded beast. The date was February 14th, 195. 5. Stalin's death was mere weeks away, though we did not know it yet. The only thing we knew was the cold, that terrible Siberian cold that froze the mercury in thermometers, seeped into your bones, and numbed you not just physically, but spiritual. Lie. My name is Alexei Volkov. Once a journalist expected to write truths for Pravda, but sent away for arrest due to the humane doubts I squeezed between the lines. This train journey was no holiday for me, it was a politely veiled exile. I carried unpublished articles in my suitcase and a one-way ticket in my pocket. It was the third day on the train. The carriages were like capsules floating outside of time and space, severed from the external world. The windows were coated in thick layers of ice formed by our own breath. It was impossible to see outside. There was only the pitch-black darkness of the night and, occasionally, the flickering lights of distant villages appearing as if they belonged to another plan. I took refuge in the dining car. This place was different from the rest of the train. Heavy burgundy velvet curtains, polished mahogany tables, and a dense, spicy cloud of tobacco smoke hanging in the air. Steam rising from the samovar danced around the yellow bulbs on the ceiling. Inside, it was warm, noisy, and filled with an artificial sense of safety. People drank their vodka here, whispered about politics, and tried to escape the white death awaiting outside. The waiter, a limping man who was clearly an old soldier, placed a hot glass of tea before me. The lemon slice floating in it was the only color in this gray world. I took out my noteb. Okay. Not because I had anything to write, but simply because I needed to hold a pen to stop my hands from trembling. However, the atmosphere of the carriage was different that night. The dining car, usually filled with drunken laughter and the clatter of dominoes, had fallen under the influence of a strange gravitational field. The center of this field was the largest table in the very middle of the car. And at that table sat Viktor Kogan. It was impossible not to recognize him. His photographs appeared frequently in the scientific journals of the Soviet Union, hailed as the iron intellect breaking the West's code. But seeing him in the flesh was far more intimidating than any photograph. He was in his early 50s, yet his face bore no trace of age. It was as if his skin were not made of living tissue, but of smoothed marble. His eyes, words are insufficient to describe those eyes. Gray, cold, and piercing. When he looked at you, he didn't see a human being, he saw a data set to be solved, a cluster of variables. His navy blue suit was impossibly neat for someone who had been living on a train for 3 days. His shirt's cufflinks were silver, glinting slightly with every movement of tea. He trained. Unlike the other passengers, there was no vodka or food on his table. There were only papers. Piles of paper, rulers, compasses, and fountain pens with black ink. Kogan was not alone. Opposite him sat an assistant in his early 20s with timid eyes, constantly taking note. Bakuri. The boy watched his master with a mixture of fear and admiration. Whenever Kogan reached for his cigarette, Bakuri readied his lighter. Whenever Kogan frowned, Bakuri held his breath. The rest of the carriage had formed an invisible circle around this table. Factory managers, bureaucrats, and their wives in fur coats at nearby tables had ceased their own conversations to listen to Kogan's resonant, metallic voice. Kogan was a cryptologist, but in that moment, he was an emperor. An emperor of knowledge. Order, Kogan said, snapping his silver cigarette case shut. The resulting click cut through the hum of the carriage like a knife. Order is the only truth of the universe, Bakuri. What we call chaos is merely a complex order we have not yet decoded. Bakuri deaded quickly. But what about human nature, sir? Emotions, art, music. Are these also part of the order? Kogan blew smoke into the air. The smoke rings rose in perfect circles. That is the greatest fallacy, he said with a disdainful smile. People think emotions are unpredictable. Yet love, fear, hatred, they are all biochemical algorithms. If you gather enough data, you can calculate when a man will fall in love or when he will kill someone, just as you calculate a solar eclipse. He placed his hand on the large, photocopied document on his table. It was the lost Babylonian lament. Even in a black and white photocopy, the complexity and weight of the cuneiform on that clay tablet could be felt. History. Kogan continued, tracing his finger over the ancient symbols. History is a coded text written by fools, which intellects like ours are forced to decipher. This tablet, this damned piece of clay that no one has solved for thousands of years. People look at this and see mystery. I see only poorly designed encryption. And tonight... Kogan paused. With his pen, he aggressively crossed out a group of symbols he had been fixated on for hours. Tonight, before dawn breaks, I will tear the language out of this tablet. I will lift its mystical veil and reveal the mathematical skeleton beneath. Everyone in the carriage seemed spellbound. Kogan's absolute confidence, this unshakable hubris, was both disturbing and magnet. I see. He spoke as if he owned the world. However, in the darkest corner of the carriage, there was something that did not belong to Kogan's world. Leaning against the foggy window, wearing a grey coat several sizes too big, was a man like a shadow. Elias. I noticed him for the first time at that moment, right after Kogan's grand claim. Because the hands of this man, who had been motionless as an object until then, began to tremble as Kogan's poke. The empty tea glass on his table tinkled slightly under the influence of this tremor. Clink. Clink. C-L-I-N-K. This sound was the only discordant note in Kogan's symphony. I, Alexei Volkov, laid my pen down on my notebook. My old journalistic instinct, that ability to smell trouble, had awakened. Tonight, on this train, it wasn't just a code that would be broken. Tonight, here, we would descend into the darkest depths of the human soul. And in those depths, there was no mathematics, no order. There was only smoke, ice, and silence. Time flowed differently in the dining car than in the outside world. While Siberian winds battered the railway line outside, inside, the clinking of crystal glasses and the sound of silver cutlery maintained a strange, aristocratic rhythm. I continued to watch Viktor Kogan from my table, staring at my cold soup. As a journalist, I had met countless politicians, murderers, and artists. I knew how to see behind people's masks. But Kogan was different. He had no mask, his face seemed cast directly from metal. The waiter approached Kogan's table with trembling hands. On the tray was steaming borscht and thinly sliced black breya. Without raising his head, with just a slight movement of his hand, Kogan signaled where the tray should be placed. As the waiter set the plate down, not a single drop of soup splashed onto the white tablecloth. It was as if even gravity obeyed Kogan's discipline. Bakuri, Kogan said before taking the first spoonful of his soup. His voice resembled the thin sound of a knife being sharpened. Did you double-check that third data set? The young assistant swallowed his mouthful with difficulty. There were dark circles under his eyes. Clearly, he hadn't slept in days. Yes, sir. I ran the frequency analysis 3 times. But what? Kogan spoon paused in mid-ari. But the results are inconsistent, Professor. The distribution of symbols appears random. It is as if the person who wrote this text changed the rules while writing it. Kogan slowly lowered his spoon into the bowl. This movement created an effect as loud as a gun being placed on the table. Randomness, Kogan said, grimacing as if the word left a bad taste in his mouth. There is no such thing as randomness in the universe, boy. There is only insufficient data. Even the fall of a die is not random if you know the angle of the throw, the air resistance, the friction coefficient of the table. You see that the result is inevitable. He took the napkin from the table and dabbed his lips. What you call a random shows that the intelligence of the Babylonian priest was superior to yours. The man buried the code in such complex chaos that you mistake it for noise. But I? His eyes gleamed. I can hear the melody within that noise, sir. At that moment, a general sitting at one of the nearby tables, his uniform laden with medals, gathered his courage and interjected. He was likely impressed by Kogan's fame and wanted to be part of this intellectual conversa. Tyon. Excuse me, Professor Kogan, the general said, raising his vodka glass. His voice was booming, but his eyes were evasive. I've read about you in the papers. They say you helped break the German Enigma codes. But this is just a clay tablet, isn't it? I mean, not a military strategy. Just a dead language. Why go to such lengths? GTHS. The carriage fell into silence. Everyone waited for Kogan's answer. I held my breath. Kogan stopped eating. He slowly turned his chair toward the general. I was certain that gaze made the general feel not like a soldier on a battlefield, but like an insect being examined on a lab table. General, Kogan said, pronouncing the rank like an insult. How do you find the location of your enemy in a war? The general was taken aback. Well, with reconnaissance planes. With radio signals. Simple, Kogan said. But what if your enemy died 3,000 years ago? What if your enemy has no army, only words? What if your enemy uses a language designed like a virus to hijack your mind? He stood up. His shadow fell over the general. This tablet, General, is the oldest cipher in human history. Legend has it that when the Tower of Babel fell, human languages were confounded. God punished thee. It is believed this tablet was written immediately after that moment of confusion by the last man who hadn't lost his mind. If I solve this code, I won't just be reading a text. He pressed his finger onto the complex symbols on the paper on his table. I will reach the pure state of the human mind, the uncorrupted first form of language. This is a power greater than splitting the atom. You conquer territories, General, I conquer meaning. The general's face flushed. He couldn't say a word. He simply downed his drink and turned away. Kogan returned to his meal with the air of a victorious commander. I realized then, for this man, every dialogue was a war, and he was like a tyrant who could not tolerate lozenge. "Gee! Let's eat," he said to Bakuri, as if the tension moments ago had never happened. "The night will be long. I have a theory about the silence symbol in the fourth column. We can link it to a mathematical constant, perhaps a linguistic constant similar to pi." As I took my notes in the corner, the unease within me grew. Kogan was trying to solve that tablet like a machine. He reduced words to numbers, feelings to equations. But Babylon was a city of poets and priests, not mathematicians. And right at that moment, from that dark, forgotten corner of the carriage, that sound was heard again. This time not a word, but a RHYT. HM. Click. Click. Click, click. The man in the grey coat, Elias, was tapping his teaspoon on the table. But this was not a random tap. It was a regular rhythm, just as Kogan had mentioned. Like an annoying, persistent metronome interrupting Kogan's speech. CH. Kogan stopped chewing his food. His eyes slowly slid toward that corner. The Emperor felt his throne sharky. Ing. By the time midnight passed, the crowd in the dining car had thinned. The general had long since passed out, and the women in fur coats had retired to their cabins. All that remained were a few souls cursed with insomnia, the waiter dozing in the corner, and of course, Viktor Kogan, who had not left the head of his table for a moment. The snowstorm outside had intensified. Every time the wind slammed against the metal body of the carriage, the lamps inside flickered slightly, and shadows danced eerily on the walls. It was as if the train had left the land of the living and entered a purgatory ruled by ghosts. Kogan took a sip from the cold tea in front of him and grimaced. His assistant, Bakuri, was struggling to keep his eyes open against exhaustion. "Professor," Bakuri said, his voice no different from a whisper. "Perhaps you should rest a little. You haven't slept since Berlin, that's 4 days." Kogan dropped the compass in his hand onto the table. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. In that moment, just for a second, I saw the crack in that marble face, that human fatigue. But he recovered immediately, put his glasses back on, and donned his mask once more. "Sleep," Kogan said, looking at the photocopy of the tablet on the table with a mixture of hatred and admiration. Hansel wanted to sleep too. "Do you remember, Bakuri? Do you remember Professor Hansel?" Bakuri flinched. "Yes, sir. From the University of Vienna. The archaeologist who found this tablet. The first man to find it and be swallowed by it," Kogan corrected. His voice was cold. Hansel mistook this text for a poem. With an emotional approach, he compared it to ancient Sumerian hymns. He didn't leave his room for 6 months. And what happened in the end? One morning, he opened the window of his study and let himself fall onto the cobblestones of Vienna. There was a single note on his desk, the voices. They won't stop anymore. The carriage turned ice cold. Kogan smiled slightly, but there was no joy in it. People called it the curse of the tablet. The English linguist Evans who came after Hansel. He approached this text from a spiritual angle too. The result? He died in a mental asylum, choking on his own tongue. Everyone believed there was a malevolent spirit inside this piece of clay. Kogan leaned over the table, his voice lowering. "But I don't believe in curses, Bakuri. I believe in incompetence. Hansel and Evans died because their minds were weak. They dove into the chaos and drowned there. I, however, will dry out that chaos. I will purge this text of its emotions and turn it into a pure math problem. And mathematics kills no one. As I took notes in my corner, I sensed that this rationalization by Kogan was actually a shield to suppress his own fear. He knew it too. He knew this tablet was not normal. "Look here," Kogan said, tapping his pen excitedly in the middle of the paper. "Fourth column, 7th line. This symbol group." Evans translated this as rising sun. "Hansel as tie of God." Both were wrong. According to frequency analysis, this symbol repeats exactly 144 times in the rest of the text. 144, Bakuri. The square of 12. The basis of Babylonian mathematics. This is not a god. This is a number. This is a unit of time. Kogan leaned back, drunk on victory. We killed God, Bakuri. We reduced him to a calendar page. That is how a curse is broken. Right at that moment, the voice coming from that dark, forgotten corner of the carriage cut through Kogan's victory like a knife. It is not a number. The voice was frail, brittle, but strangely clear. Even the howling of the wind could not drown it out. Kogan froze. Bakuri looked around in fear. I dropped my notebook into my lap. Kogan slowly turned his chair toward that dark corner, toward the pile of the grey coat. "You?" Kogan said. "The lunatic who makes noise while eating. Are you speaking with Hansel's ghost now?" The man in the shadows, Elias, slowly stood up. The light illuminated half of his face. A pale, unshaven face with sunken cheeks. But his eyes. In those eyes, the thin line between madness and genius flickered. Elias approached the table with careful steps, as if walking through a minefield. He stopped at the edge of the table. He didn't even look at the paper Kogan had declared victory over. He looked directly at Kogan. "Hansel didn't jump from that window because he was weak," Elias said. His voice trembled, but his words were solid. Evans didn't swallow his tongue because he was weak. They died because they understood. Understood what? Kogan asked with a mocking attitude. Mathematics. No, Elias said. Loneliness. Elias raised a trembling finger and pointed from a distance at the symbol Kogan had just marked. That symbol repeats 144 times, yes. You know how to count. But you don't know why it repeats. That is not a unit of time, Viktor Kogan. That is a heartbeat. The rhythm of a panicked heart. That symbol is not a rising sun. That symbol is a wall. And every time it repeats, the walls get a little close. Ah. Kogan laughed. But this laugh was tense. A wall? The symbol for walled in Babylonian texts is different. I know the entire literature by heart. You know the walls in books, Elias whispered, leaning a little closer to the table. I know the walls that are scratched by fingernails. The smile on Kogan's face faded. There was an uncanny knowledge in this disheveled man before him that wasn't written in books, that didn't fit into formulas. Who are you? Kogan asked, a note of unease in his voice for the first time. Which university? Which institute? Elias shook his head with a bitter smile. My university has no diploma, Mr. Kogan. No graduates either. Only survivors. And believe me, the author of that tablet was my classmate. The train suddenly switched tracks violently. The carriage shook, the lights went out for a moment, and when they came back on, Elias was already sitting in the empty chair at the other end of the tar. Bull. The duel had begun. There was no turning back now. Two minds faced each other at a table, one, the world's greatest master of logic, the other, a survivor who had learned to live where logi ends. And the clay tablet sitting in the middle of the table seemed to wake from its slumber of thousands of years, watching its new victims. The tension at the table had turned into a physical weight. Kogan looked at this uninvited guest sitting opposite him as one would look at a rat that had entered his laboratory. But this rat seemed to know the result of the experiment. A university without a diploma, Kogan repeated, his voice ice-cold. And a Babylonian priest as a classmate. Your storytelling is evidently stronger than your scientific side. Elias poured himself a glass of water from the carafe on the table. His hand shook so much that some of the water spilled onto the tablecloth. Kogan looked at this disorder with disgust. They took me in the winter of 1942, Elias began. His voice was like a whisper seeping through the metallic creaks of the train. He was speaking not to Kogan, but to his reflection in the water glass. Political branch. They never told me my crime. Maybe it was a misunderstanding, maybe someone just needed to fill a quota. I expected them to send me to Siberia, to the mines. Cold, hunger, whippings. I had prepared myself for all of it. He raised his head. His eyes pierced through the carriage walls, looking at a very distant time. But they didn't do that to me, Victor. They took me to the Hotel Metropole. Sounds luxurious, doesn't it? But that wasn't a hotel. It was a slaughterhouse of the mind. Bakuri had put down his pen and was listening with his mouth open. Kogan had crossed his arms, shifting into a defensive posture. They put me in room 303. The first thing I felt when I entered was nothingness. There was no window, it was bricked up. There was no furniture. Just an iron cot bolted to the floor and a thin mattress. And everything was painted white. Elias's breathing quickened. Walls lime white. Ceiling white. Door white. And that lamp. That bulb in a wire cage on the ceiling. It never went out. There was no night. There was no day. Just an endless, blinding, burning whitens. There was nothing with which I could measure time. My watch was taken. Meals were given silently through a slot under the door. The guard's shoes were covered in felt. I couldn't even hear their footsteps. The first days, Elias said, his voice cracking. In the first days, I fought with my logic. Just like you, Victor. I solved math problems in my head. I recited all the poems I knew from memory. I narrated Russian history from beginning to end to those white walls. I thought if I kept my mind busy, I could be protected. Kogan interrupted. This is standard isolation procedure. A strong will can withstand it. Elias laughed bitterly. This sound sent a shiver through everyone in the carriage. A strong will? Victor, the human mind is a millstone. If you don't throw wheat under it, it starts to grind itself. By the second week, my memories began to run out. The colors of my childhood faded. I tried to remember my mother's face. I couldn't. There was only a gray blur. With no data coming from the outside world, my brain went hungry. And do you know what a hungry brain does? It produces hallucinations. Elias leaned over the table. His pupils were dilated. The walls started breathing. I saw faces under that white paint. I started hearing the echo of my own screams, though I hadn't even opened my mouth. I was going mad. I felt as if my brain was liquefying inside my skull and flowing out of my ears. That silence. That absolute silence was the loudest torture. And then, a strange, manic expression of enlightenment appeared on Elias's face. Then I found it. What? Bakuri asked involuntarily. Why? A crack in the wall, Elias said, as if speaking of a holy relic. Right at the head of my bed, a microscopic crack under the plaster. And right next to it, a small, yellowish stain formed by dampness. They became my universe. I stared at that crack for hours, days. I looked so closely that it began to look like a map. Then I noticed that small shadow on the ceiling. A speck of dust on the floor. I collected every flaw, every stain, every roughness in the room. They became my alphabet. Kogan shifted uneasily in his seat. You created a language from stains? This is nonsense. It was a necessity. Elias shouted. His voice rose for the first time. I had no one to talk to. No voice to hear. So I connected those stains. That crack in the wall became pain. The shadow on the ceiling waiting. The stain on the floor God. I created my own grammar, my own dictionary. I translated the silence of that white room into the language of the walls. Elias pressed his trembling finger onto the Babylonian tablet on the tab. Lo. That is why, he whispered. That is why I can read that tablet. Because that priest was in the same place. Maybe not in a physical cell, but in a mental white room. His gods had fallen silent. His city was burning. And as he pressed cuneiforms onto that clay to keep from going mad, he wasn't writing a prayer. He was making the silence in his mind tangible. Lo. Those repetitions you think are in numbers. They are the rhythm of a prisoner banging his head against the wall, Victor. Thud. 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 Kogan paused for a moment. This terrible story Elias told had opened a breach in his sterile, mathematical world. But his ego immediately stepped in to close that brayer. CH. This is a very tragic story, Kogan said, trying to recover his voice. Post-traumatic stress disorder. The pareidolia effect, the disease of seeing meaning in random shapes. But this doesn't show that you are reading the tablet correctly. It only shows that you see your own trauma everywhere. Elias smiled. But this was not a smile of victory. It was the sad smile of someone who sees a disaster coming. You think so, Professor? Then let me ask you a question. Elias looked into the deepest part of Kogan's eyes. If I am just hallucinati, why is it that right now, in that expensive suit, surrounded by people? Why is your hand under the table trembling? Kogan's gaze froze. His hand, indeed, was trembling slightly on his knee under the table. No one had seen it. Except Eli. Because, Elias said, as if delivering the final blow. You hear it too. You hear that silence between the numbers too. You just can't admit it to yourself. Right at that moment, as if the universe itself wanted to intervene in this conversation, a noise erupted. The train shook with a terrible metallic scream. The screech of brakes set everyone's teeth on edge in the dining car. Glasses slid off tables and crashed to the floor, the samovar tipped over. The general nearly flew out of his seat. The locomotive stopped suddenly and violently, as if it had hit a massive wall of snow. The lights went out completely. The carriage was plunged into pitch darkness. Only the howl of the storm outside and the panic-stricken whispers of the passengers could be heard. A few seconds later, the emergency lights kicked in. A pale, reddish light illuminated the carriage. This light turned the atmosphere inside from a train into a submarine, or perhaps into that claustrophobic cell Elias had just described. The conductor burst into the carriage holding a lantern. His face was white as a sheet. "Stay calm, comrades," he shouted, but he couldn't hide the panic in his own voice. "There is heavy snow accumulation on the line. The locomotive is stuck. We have to shovel. It might take a few hours." "A few hours?" Kogan boomed. In the darkness, his voice sounded even more threatening. "I need to reach Moscow, the Academy of Sciences." "What is this disgrace?" Kogan had stood up. He was trying to use his authority against the train and Mother Nature. But the storm outside didn't care about Professor Kogan's title. Elias, on the other hand, hadn't even moved. Under that red emergency light, his face looked even more shadowed, more uncanny. "We stopped," Elias said, as if talking to himself. "Just like time stopped. Just like in that room." Kogan turned to Elias in anger. His nerves were frayed. The train stopping meant losing control, and Kogan hated losing control. "I don't have time to listen to your prophecies," Kogan shouted. "This is a technical malfunction. A natural event. It has nothing to do with your mystical nonsense. A technical malfunction," Elias repeated. Then he pointed to the tablet on the table. "Just like the Tower of Babel, isn't it? That was a technical malfunction too. Oh. People tried to reach the sky, God's secrets. They went too high. And then..." Elias raised his hand in the air like a tower and suddenly brought it due. WN. The hours spent under the red emergency lights had turned the carriage into a ghost ship. The cold seeped through the metal walls, penetrating our coats and gloves. Our breath formed grey plumes of smoke in the air. But Viktor Kogan was sweating. In the light of the gas lamp held by the trembling hands of his assistant Bakuri, Kogan was hunched over the papers like a monk in prayer. His pen moved across the paper, making aggressive sounds. Scratch. Scratch. Draw. "I found it," Kogan whispered suddenly. His voice cracked the silence like a frozen lake fracturing. He raised his head. His eyes were bloodshot, his glasses had slipped to the tip of his nose, but there was a wild smile of victory on his face. He looked directly at Elias. "Your walls have crumbled, lunatic," he shouted. His voice was raspy. "Your poetic, pathetic stories have knelt before science tonight." He held the paper up in the air. "This text is not a prayer. Not a scream. This text is an astronomical catalogue. That complex cycle in the fourth column. That describes the movements of the planet Venus in the sky. Babylonian priests calculated Venus's 8-year cycle as 584 days. Here it is. That repetition you call a heartbeat is actually the planet's orbital period." Kogan spread his arms wide like an orchestra conductor. "Do you see, Bakuri? Do you see, General? There is no chaos. There is only the mathematics of the sky. This man wasn't suffering, this man was watching the stars. And I, Viktor Kogan, am the only person in 1,000 years to see what he was looking at. Everyone in the carriage, the general, the waiter, even I, was spellbound by Kogan's unshakable logic. Could the man be right? Were the terrible stories Elias told merely the fabrications of a sick mind? Numbers didn't lie, did they? Kogan turned to Elias to deliver the final blow. "Now, retreat to your corner and return to your silence. Because when science speaks, superstitions must remain silent." Elias hadn't even moved during Kogan's tirade of victory. There was neither surprise nor defeat on his face. Only a deep, bottomless sorrow. He slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled handkerchief. He wiped his lips. Then, he spoke in a soft, almost compassionate voice, as if teaching a child. "Venus," Elias said. "The morning star. And also the evening star. A beautiful theory, Viktor. Logical. Consistent. Safe." He stood up. He walked toward the light of the gas lamp. "But there is a problem, Professor. The symbol used for Venus in Babylonian astronomy is the Star of Ishtar. An 8-pointed star. But on your paper..." Elias leaned over the table and pointed to the symbol Kogan had just circled. "Your paper doesn't have 8 points. There is a vortex there. A spiral curling inward, never-ending." Kogan paused. He narrowed his eyes. "That is just a calligraphic difference. Handwriting style." "No," Elias said. His voice hardened. "That is not a style. That priest wasn't looking at the stars, Viktor. That priest was at the bottom of a well. And the only thing he saw when he looked up was that piece of sky getting smaller, darkening. That spiral is not Venus's orbit. That spiral is his narrowing consciousness." "You are wrong," Kogan shouted, but his voice was no longer so booming. "I am not wrong," Elias said. "Because you only see what you want to see. You see an orbit there because your life consists of orbits. You draw circles, Viktor. From home to the Institute, from the Institute to home. The same circles. You never go out. You never cross the line." Elias pushed the other papers on the table aside and revealed the last line of the tablet. Then their languages were confused. No one could understand anyone else. Just like we can't understand each other right now, Viktor. You speak Russian, I speak Russian. But in reality, we are both shouting in different languages. Kogan sat back down at the table. He looked desperately at his assistant. "Bakuri, hold the lantern. We will continue working. Whether this train moves or not, I will solve this cipher tonight." The assistant brought the gas lamp closer with trembling hands. Kogan, stubbornly, ambitiously, buried himself in the papers. As the storm outside rocked the carriage, Kogan tried to preserve his own sanity by finding the order in that piece of paper. But I, Alexei Volkov, saw the sweat on Kogan's forehead in that dim light. I saw that trembling in his hand holding the pen, which he could no longer hide. Kogan wasn't working, Kogan was running. He was running from that terrible truth Elias brought, the truth of meaninglessness. And Elias sat at the other end of the table with the patience of a statue, waiting for his prey to fall into its own trap. If your theory is correct, if this is an astronomy catalogue, then read me the last line. What is written when the Venus cycle is complete? It writes cycle complete, doesn't it? It writes start again. Kogan looked at the paper. His eyes roamed over the symbols. His lips moved, but no sound came out. The vein in his forehead bulged. "Read it!" Elias thundered. "Read it, Viktor! What does your science say?" Kogan swallowed. This symbol group. It's not in the literature. This is undefined. It is not undefined, Elias whispered. It just isn't in your dictionary. Allow me to translate. Elias sidled up to Kogan, as if he were his shadow. Kogan could no longer resist. It was as if he were tied to his chair with invisible strings. The first symbol, Elias said, holding his finger in the air without touching the paper. You called this king. The man wearing the crown. But look closely, Viktor. The points of that crown don't face up. They face down. That is not a crown. That is barbed wire. That is a cage. And that small line inside. That is not king. That is self. An imprisoned, shrunken self on the verge of non-existence. Kogan's breathing accelerated. His chest heaved. He was on the verge of a panic attack. The second symbol, Elias continued, ruthlessly. You called this victory. But in the Babylonian language, the symbol for victory stands upright. This symbol is horizontal, crawling on the ground. This isn't a victory, Victor. This is surrender. This is the last breath of a man saying, I have no strength left to fight. Stop, Kogan said, his voice muffled. Stop now. But Elias didn't stop. He was now deciphering not just the tablet, but Kogan's soul. And the last symbol. That thing you call undefined. Do you know why it is undefined? Because it is something no mathematician, no general, no cryptologist wants to encounter. Elias brought his face close to Kogan's. In the flickering light of the gas lamp, the two faces blended. That symbol is a mirror, Victor. But not a mirror that shows your face. A mirror that shows the void inside you. When that priest reached the end of the tablet, he didn't find gods. He didn't find stars. He only found himself. And he was so afraid of what he saw that he was struck dumb. That last symbol is the silence of that struck tongue. Kogan gripped the table with his hands. The tablecloth crumpled under his fingers. Why are you doing this to me? Kogan groaned. That great emperor, that arrogant genius, was now like a frightened child. I just wanted to understand. I just wanted to find the order. Elias's voice softened. The wild glint in his eyes gave way to deep compassion. I know, Victor. We all want the same thing. We build walls to escape chaos. You use numbers, I use stains. But walls don't protect us. Walls only make us lonely. Elias placed his hand on Kogan's shoulder. Kogan flinched but didn't pull away. Now look at that paper, Elias said. And tell me honestly, do you see Venus there? Or do you see the truth that in this cold carriage, you will die all alone among people you don't know, with an assistant you don't even like? Absolute silence fell inside the carriage. Even the storm outside seemed to respect the weight of this moment and fell silent. Kogan slowly bowed his head. He took off his glasses and laid them on the table. With naked eyes, defenselessly, he looked at that paper. And in that moment, the great dam inside Kogan broke. I see it, he whispered. A tear slid from his eye, traversing the marble hardness of his cheek down to his chin. I see myself. And there is no one there. Kogan began to weep with sobs. This wasn't a loud cry. It was an inward, shaking weeping, heavy enough to collapse shoulders. Years of suppression, years of trying to be that cold machine, melted away in an instant. His assistant Bakuri looked at his master in astonishment. For the first time in his life, he saw that the invincible idol was actually just a scared, old man. Elias removed his hand from Kogan's shoulder. He had completed his task. He hadn't just broken a code, he had set a soul free. But this freedom came at a painful price. As Kogan slumped over the table, shaking with sobs, Elias silently retreated back into the darkness. He didn't want the spotlight. He was a messenger who had come only to speak the truth, and now he returned to his own shadow. Right at that moment, a strong jolt came from beneath the carriage. Metal ground against metal. The lights flickered, and suddenly, those blinding yellow electric lights came back on. The locomotive had started. The train was moving. The physical journey would continue. But for the man sitting at the table, Viktor Kogan, the journey was already over. He had reached the final station. When the first lights of morning lit the ice-covered windows of the Trans-Siberian Express, the air inside the carriage had changed. The suffocating, electric atmosphere of the night was gone, replaced by a strange, melancholic tranquility. The train glided toward the grey silhouette of Vladivostok. The damp, salty smell of the Pacific Ocean seeped in through the vents, overpowering the heavy scent of tobacco and sweat. Viktor Kogan sat at his table in the same position. The photocopies of the tablet before him lay scattered like the spoils, or perhaps the corpses, of the war fought that night. But Kogan wasn't looking at them. He had fixed his eyes on the window. The hard, granite expression on his face had softened, giving way to a void difficult to describe. His hair was messy. His flawless tie was loosened. He was no longer an emperor, he was a tired king who had abdicated his throne. His assistant Bakuri was hesitant to approach his master. He held a glass of fresh tea but couldn't decide whether to place it on the table. "Leave it," Kogan said. His voice was so hoarse Bakuri had to read his lips. "Leave it and sit down, Bakuri. Stop taking notes. Just sit." This was an impossible order to hear from Kogan. Bakuri obeyed in astonishment. For the first time, Kogan was looking at his assistant not as a data source, but as a human being. The train's whistle blew, long and mournful like a farewell. The scream of the metal wheels slowed, and finally stopped with a deep hiss amidst white clouds of steam. "Vladivostok!" The announcement was heard. Final station. The other passengers in the carriage, the general, the women in fur coats, gathered their things with sleepy eyes and headed for the exit. Everyone had already forgotten what happened at night and returned to the rush of daily life. But that man in the grey coat, Elias, he hadn't forgotten. Elias picked up his old leather suitcase. On his face was the peace of an envoy who had completed his mission. He paused as he passed Kogan's table. He seemed about to say something. Maybe a goodbye, maybe a consolation. But he changed his mind. Because they had reached the place where words end. He simply bowed his head slightly. This gesture was not out of respect for Kogan, but a salute to another soul bearing the same wound. Kogan raised his head too. The eyes of the two men met for the last time. In that moment, there was no anger in Kogan's eyes. There was gratitude. Elias had shown him his greatest fear, but at the same time, released him from that terrible prison of perfection. Elias glided through the door. He blended into the crowd on the platform, into the grey smoke and rushing people. Like a ghost, he vanished silently from the world he had entered like a ghost. He left behind neither a trace nor a name. I, Alexei Volkov, approached Kogan one last time as I gathered my belongings. I was driven not by journalistic curiosity, but by a human impulse. "Professor," I said hesitantly, "when you return to Moscow, will you continue your work? What will you write about that tablet?" Kogan reached into his pocket as if he hadn't heard my question. He took out that silver cigarette case. His fingers traced over the metal, but he didn't open it. He just felt its weight. "I won't write," Kogan said. His voice was calm as the ocean wind outside. Words are sometimes just noises we invent to cover the truth, Volkov. You asked what that tablet describes. He drew a circle on the foggy glass with his finger. An empty circle. That tablet describes nothing. And that is the heaviest burden in the universe, nothingness. He smiled. But this wasn't his old arrogant smile. It was a broken, sad, but genuine smile. I think I will just listen to the silence now. Let's see what it tells me. I stepped off the train. Vladivostok's freezing cold hit my face. When I looked back, I saw Viktor Kogan still sitting at that table, staring at the blank papers in front of him. After that day, I never saw Professor Kogan again. According to what I read in the papers, he resigned and settled in a small house in a remote town in Siberia, far from people. He didn't write a single article. That Babylonian tablet continues to sleep in the dusty storage of a museum, not as a mystery waiting to be solved, but as a dark mirror of the human soul. And I never forgot that night. Whenever I hear a train whistle, whenever it snows, Elias's whisper echoes in my ears. The echo on the wall has ceased, and I no longer exist. And I understand that the hardest language in this world is not Sumerian or encrypted codes. The hardest language is trying to translate the silence inside oneself. Unfortunately, the dictionary for that language is found in no library. The end.